on the significance of inequality in general when it comes to health, and what your views are on how much inequality matters.
Okay. So to begin, I'll start maybe just describing what we know about inequalities in health. And that's that there are inequalities in health both within societies and between societies, right? So we know that, for example, life expectancy in a rural area in China is much lower than it is perhaps in New York City. And that's inter-society. But then we also know within New York City itself that the African-American population in the Bronx has a much lower life expectancy than perhaps South Manhattan.
Well, according to one of Amartya Sen's recent books, I think the lowest life expectancy of African-Americans in the U.S. is actually lower than many provinces in India.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It's impressive.
Yeah.
I mean, so there was a very famous paper published in the journal PLOS Medicine by Chris J. L. Murray and his group, which attempted to look at 8 Americas. And so what they did is they effectively fractioned the United States based on health outcomes into 8 recognizable demographics, and that ranged from poor southern rural blacks to rich northeastern urban Asian Americans, actually, who had the best life expectancy.
Really?
Which looks good for you, G.
Or at least my mom and dad.
Yeah, your mom and dad. And so he was able to look at these different demographic groups, which predicted life expectancy pretty regularly.
Okay.
Which is a really interesting exercise, and it's interesting because Chris Murray himself, who actually was he was a Rhodes Scholar back in the day here.
Okay. And by the way, we're going to put links up to all of the papers and books and articles mentioned in the podcast on the website.
Awesome. So Chris Murray, he's interested, for the most part, he runs the Global Burden of Disease Project.
Okay.
So he's more interested in inter-society inequalities in health.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to take that same concept, right, and really apply that to one society, which really shows that this inequalities question isn't a matter of us, them, it's a matter of us.
Yeah.
And it's pervasive across health outcomes. Across metrics of socioeconomic status, across metrics of region, across particular areas within regions, and obviously across race and ethnicity. And we can demonstrate differences in how healthy people are, regardless of metrics. You can look at preterm birth. You can look at self-reported well-being. You can look at life expectancy, overall mortality. You can look at other metrics like depression, prevalence, anxiety, other mental health disorders, obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and you see these disparities across the board.
And these disparities are correlated with income, race, ethnicity, these factors.
Right.
That's what the study is showing.
Right.
Okay. So let's take one step back and let me ask you we're already in pretty normative territory.
Right.
Let me ask you this. Are inequalities in health outcomes bad? And if so, are they more bad than other inequalities?
So I'll give you my answer, and then I'll try and back that up.
Sure.
I will say, obviously, caveated, that as somebody who's dedicated most of his career to studying health outcomes and plans to in the future.
But that's why we have you here. So.
Right. So which reflects a little bit about your thoughts on it. I would say health inequalities are bad, full stop.
Full stop.
And the reason that they're bad is because, well, there's kind of 2 ways to look at this, right? If we say that health is a prerequisite to functioning in different ways, which would be Sen's capabilities approach, then without health, one can't actually have capabilities to do other things. And so if, in that sense, then health becomes a prerequisite to any sort of justice. Now, when we have inequalities in health that are systematic, right, and across axes that are structurally defined, like race and socioeconomic status, then we see that there's systematic injustice with regard to health inequalities. Now, because health is a prerequisite, as opposed to maybe other material metrics of inequalities, right, this becomes profoundly more unjust than inequalities in other areas, right? And so that's now where I've brought us is that inequalities in health are unjust. Now, if we can debate whether or not injustice is bad, but I feel like I'm probably not I'm not qualified to.
I feel like I'm gonna end up on the same side of the fence as you, but I'll try to play devil's advocate as far as I can, just for the sake of argument.
Sure,
but go ahead, finish your thought on that.
And then the other approach is Rawls talks a lot about justice as fairness, and if being born as a black man in Harlem, right, is going to lower my life expectancy, right? That's profoundly unfair and therefore unjust.
So, again, the unfair part of this for the listeners is that I tend to agree with you. It seems like health can be treated somewhat as a special good, insofar as not only is it an end, but it is also a fundamental, instrumental good to achieving all types of capabilities and freedoms that...
Any type.
Pretty much anything, right? That being said, on the face of it, I think it is a valid question to raise, though, because I'm less inclined to argue that the same is true for other material goods, right? I don't really have too much of a problem with there being inequalities in consumption of, say, pedicures, or like yacht vacations. They're nice. Have you ever gotten a pedicure?
I haven't.
It's actually pretty nice.
Really?
Yeah, my girlfriend took me once. That's neither here nor there. But right, so
my wife keeps threatening.
So I'm okay with some inequality in levels of consumption, especially conspicuous consumption, for two reasons. One reason is I just don't have too much of an aversion towards it, insofar as everyone has a different utility function, and I feel like people derive pleasure from different things, and to assume that everyone has the same utility function is a pretty paternalistic and arrogant thing to do. But the second reason being that, and this is the typical economist argument, but I think this is actually a decent one, that there are valuable incentive effects that require some degrees of inequality, and inequality, again, that normative word, but some degrees of variation in payoffs, outcomes, goods, whatever you want to put in that blank, that allow societies to grow their pie, right? To achieve a higher level of overall well-being. Now, insofar as this well-being is mediated by material goods, then growing the material pie is maybe necessary. Now, we can also get into questions as to what extent do we grow it, how much, at what sacrifice of equality do we grow the pie, etc. And those are, I think, that's where that argument loses some of its firepower, and that's where I think I'm inclined to say that the argument that you put forward, the SEN sort of capabilities and inequalities in health as a fundamental social justice problem argument, are more attractive to me. They make more sense philosophically. To
hit that incentives point, though, that's an interesting point, because when we think about incentives, some people have to have something and other people don't, and there has to be a certain amount of mixing insofar as something can operate as an incentive.
Right.
Now, that means, right, that and I'm wandering in your territory here, right, but in order for something to be an incentive for somebody to do something, right, that means that person has to invest whatever it is, whatever resources that person has, time, energy,
right,
etc., into getting that, whatever that incentive is. Now, the problem with health is that it's one of those resources that needs to be invested, and if you don't have it, right, then what is it that you actually are investing into getting that outcome of health? So it takes health to make health.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of why health can't really work as something that should operate as an incentive in our society. And then that would shoot down one of the arguments against addressing or the need or the justice issue around health inequalities.
Right.
One of the critiques of that.
Well, but one could also argue that it takes money to make money too.
True.
Insofar as if you don't have any right? If you don't have any capital to begin with, no one's going to lend you enough capital for you to make anything out of it. Now, that's a pretty hairy argument. I don't really want to get into the specifics there because that's even the finance part of that is not even my territory anymore.
But the pushback on that would be without health. So if you think about the end point of health is death. There's nothing. There's no life. So without that, there's absolutely nothing. So if you think about it, health kind of it's a prerequisite to any type of value function, right?
So it's the fundamental instrumental good.
It is the fundamental instrumental good.
See, okay,
right, and a fundamental end,
right? So
right,
but maybe that's the stronger argument. To me, let's think about that for a minute.
So, for example, if you have a yacht, right, and so you're getting a pedicure while on a yacht, okay. This is like the ultimate conspicuous consumption.
You're Keisha.
Right? While you're actually hanging out with Keisha, who's giving you the pedicure on the yacht. If you're unhealthy, you're not enjoying any of that. Right? So let's say you are also, you're terminal with cancer and you're feeling all the symptoms, right, of that cancer. You're not being heavily sedated and treated. You're feeling all the symptoms of that cancer. You can't enjoy any of it.
That's an interesting point.
Right? So it in that sense, I'm kind of pushing back to it being the fundamental prerequisite. It has to be there for anything else to be there. And so it itself can't necessarily be the incentive because it's necessary for all of the other resources of production in order for them to exist. So.
And again, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And just to add to that point, I feel like I almost made a really unfairly strawman argument about the incentive argument, but so it will go. I don't really believe in it. But
our strawman is sitting right here.
Yeah.
He's just made the argument.
And the crows are not afraid of him. But I think the incentive argument also breaks down when it comes to health. Going back to the thing that you stated earlier about it being pretty difficult for us to conceptualize what a advantageous health outcome would be. It's more a deterioration from the status quo.
Right.
And incentivizing non-deterioration, as we know, is much less effective than incentivizing improvement in status. So I think that's where health as a special good is a pretty strong argument that can be made, even in the face of these incentive arguments, because we can incentivize people to increase their income, right? We want the Bill Gateses of the world. We want the people who are the entrepreneurs, right, to make breakthrough discoveries because they're motivated by financial or other returns, right? You could have a differential distribution of fame. And inequalities in fame, I'm not too against that,
right,
as long as it contributes positively to society. Now, we can get into discussions as to whether it does in today's society later. But yeah, treating health as a special good in that case, I think, is a pretty strong argument that can be made. Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about how we can actually apply some of these philosophical discussions into real-world policy, the U.S. healthcare bill in particular.
Okay.
And then we'll go from there.
Awesome.
Wake up in the morning feeling like P. Diddy. Grab my glasses, I'm out the door. I'm gonna hit this city. Before I leave, brush my teeth with a bottle of Jack. 'Cause when I leave for the night, I ain't coming back. I'm talking pedicure on our toes. Trying on all our clothes. Boys blowing up our phones. Drop top and playing our favorite CDs.
So I'm back with Abdul El-Sayed, talking about some of the issues surrounding inequalities in health and epidemiology more generally. So Abdul, getting back to our discussion about how much we care about inequalities in health and why, let me give you an interesting thought experiment that one of my professors laid out in a lecture recently. So assume there are two populations in a society, let's say East Coasters and West Coasters, and both initially have an average life expectancy of 50 years. And they're both of equal size, and we're giving them equal sort of welfare weights, etc. Say that there's an intervention that allows, 20 years from now, for those two populations to have 55-year average life expectancies and 65-year average life expectancies. So East Coasters live for 55 years on average, West Coasters live for 65 years. So the average of the two groups is 60.